I'm going to shift from one president to another, and I'd like to introduce Jane Hall, who will be running this session. Here you go.
Well, thank you all, and welcome to our panellists, most of whom need no introduction. I will introduce Melinda Cilento in a moment, but I just want to tell you what I think we should be doing with this session. The idea of this session is to move from the discussion that we've had, a lot of which has been around analysis of the problem, to what should we do next. But we've also, I think, we have a lot of keen minds in the room, and we haven't had enough opportunity for give and take with the panel. So I'm going to try and do some more of that, particularly in this sort of late afternoon session when it's just too tempting to lie back in those comfortable seats. So let's see how we can go. So I'm not going to invite every panel member to provide some opening statements. I'm going to try and focus some discussion and focus questions from you. So please be ready to put your hands up and wave. We've got, where are useful people with microphones? Yes, they're here. So the microphones will be delivered if you wave in the air. However, do I need to run through the panel again? Perhaps I do, starting at the end. Ross, no? Everybody recognises them, good. But I would like to introduce Melinda Cilento, who has not been here for the day. You can read about her distinguished career in the programme book. Suffice it to say that she's now CEO of the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, or CEDA, and she comes to that with experience across corporate, government and not-for-profit sectors. So Melinda, let me invite you to reflect on our theme as an opening to open the discussion.
There we go. That's the traps for newcomers, isn't it? I thought, so I am the CEO of CEDA, but I also sit on a couple of company boards. And so I thought that maybe one of the things that might be interesting, I know Grant King was here this morning from the Business Council, but I did think that maybe if I put a bit of a lens on this conversation from a business perspective, and particularly in light of some of the things we've seen coming out of the Royal Commission and the like, that maybe that's just a different lens on it. And I do think there's overlap for, in terms of broader implications for all institutions. But on the way here this morning, I thought, well, I'll jot down, a couple of points. I've got about 6 points that I sort of think are the things that I've taken out of some of the conversations as they relate to businesses, and particularly listed for-profit bigger companies, which are a real focus and I think obviously critical in terms of our economic future. So these are the things that I thought you might want to think about and I think are important. Firstly, I think there needs to be a really serious conversation about what a sustainable rate of return is for these companies. If you're a mature company in a mature industry, in a mature economy, what sort of rates of return should investors be thinking about? And when you start seeing, more than 10% per annum net profit after tax growth when the economy is growing by 3% nominally, should you be asking yourself whether maybe there's some things going on that you might want to have a closer look at? So that's number one. Number two, I think these organisations in particular need to really seriously examine their incentive structures. Remuneration clearly. I think there's been a lot of focus in the corporate world at the moment on responding to APRA's report into the CBA, a huge amount of focus on have you got the right chief risk officer, have you got the right risk processes, blah, blah, blah. If you've got incentive structures that reward people for delivering double-digit profit growth, the best risk officer in the world isn't going to prevent bad behaviour, in my view. But also there's a broader issue there about what are the behaviours and outcomes that you're rewarding within your organisation. Not just through remuneration, but through acknowledgement or through promotion or through whatever else, because that really, really matters. So that's number two. Number three, I think some of these organisations really have to reflect on the size of their organisations and management structures. So quite frankly, how is the team at the top setting the tone, and how is that tone being heard throughout the organisation, and how is your senior management team keeping its finger on the pulse of culture? And if you're huge, they are very serious questions. So that was number 3. Number 4, embrace a multi-stakeholder model of engagement. Rolls off the tongue easily, really hard to do, but absolutely I think what business in particular needs to do, and you need to be really transparent about that. As a sidebar there, I thought it was really interesting that our sister organisation in the US, the Committee for Economic Development, produced a report last year called Sustaining Capitalism, and that was one of the key themes for them, was this multi-stakeholder engagement approach. That was number 4. Number 5, I refer to this as HAS. Hear the community. Not listen to the community, hear the community, hear their expectations, act on their expectations, act in the best interests of the community and show the community that you are doing so. And this is something that if you are going to embrace a multi-stakeholder model of engagement, you absolutely must do. The number 6 that I had was, I think organisations, particularly businesses, need to get involved in solutions. You'll hear a lot more conversation these days about place-based solutions for delivering better outcomes. Our anchor institutions, whether they're universities, whether they're business, they need to be involved in finding solutions on the ground with communities. It's where the best outcomes are being delivered at the moment, but it also allows those organisations to connect to the community in a very real way and get up close to their expectations and understand them better. And then I guess the last one that I'd raise is maybe off on a little bit of a tangent, and I was thinking about this in the context of banking, but there are some policy solutions that are being delivered at the moment that I think are transformative in terms of giving consumers and the community more say on things, and the one that I wanted to call out there was the consumer data right. So the consumer data right, so putting people at the centre of these policies and empowering them to have more say, are the sorts of things that I think can really shift the dial as well. So there was sort of the 6 or 7 opening points that I had, Jane.
Well, that's a great segue for me, because one of the questions that I wanted to raise was about pay grades. And actually, it's not just about incentives, but it's about the pay for the CEOs of our top companies. Does that create an us and them divide when we see such enormous differences in pays?
I mean, I think pay matters, but actually in a practical sense too, I just think there is actually a bit of a divide. And I guess that's what I was saying. You know, I think that sits underneath my comments about getting involved in the community and trying to understand community expectations. And I mean, frankly, I can say as a company director, it's a sort of rarefied environment that you're in. And, you know, I think when you think about diversity on board directors, in terms of board composition, when I first joined the commercial board that I'm on, I was the only female on that board, and I had a lot of people saying to me, you know, what's it like being the only female? And I think this is the 3rd board that I joined, and I said, well, when I'm not the only female, I'll let you know. But more importantly, I said, actually, I think the biggest divide is not my gender, but it's where I am in my life. So I hadn't been a senior executive for 40 years. You know, I sort of said to people flippantly, I think I'm the only person who owns only one house and I still have a mortgage on that house. And so I think it's not just that pay grade. I do think there is, it is a different world, and I think, companies need to really make sure that they're connecting to the community and trying to really understand, and diversity is one part of that.
Now, audience, you remember you've got to wave to get a microphone. I'm not just going to stop and ask for questions. Anyone else on the panel want to come in on that?
Maybe just to continue
Yes.
with that theme around remuneration and governance arrangements, and just feels really appropriate again to bring a bit of a gender lens onto this. I mean, it is an important day for us to again be showing our concern about the gender pay gap. I referred to that at the beginning. And I have been too often in conversations where the primary focus of the debate is how women can get better at negotiating pay deals that look more like, frankly, the kind of executives that you've just described, Melinda. And I think we really need to challenge that. and to demonstrate that actually there is a high value to be placed on a more modest approach that has a more shared view about benefit and a more moderated approach to the way you structure remuneration, and that is a conversation that happens in the boardroom, and to build in the right kinds of incentives to trigger the kinds of beneficial, broad-based behaviours that you would want to see. And I think I've also been very struck too much by, in the debates around board and corporate governance, the way in which the not-for-profit and the community sector is often seen as the lesser in the environment, the training ground before you get into the big time over in corporate Australia. And given what I highlighted at the beginning of the day about where we rank in terms of trust and confidence in the community, I would urge the corporate community to think much more diversely about the high value of having community interests, social policy expertise embedded within the corporate governance structures. And I think that's partly what you're alluding to, Melinda, there in terms of the diversity of the profile. But that will have to be done, I think, through some, I'm of a bit of a view around some mandating on that front. I think I'm at the point of saying I just want us to be fully transparent around pay. Let's show us what it looks like, and then we can have the proper debates in the community about the value of who's getting paid what, and let's see where that takes us.
I think too that, you know, the more diversity you've got, the more it is about different perspectives. And so when you're wanting institutions to ask questions about, is this the right thing to do? Is this a safe place to work? Is this, you know, all of the more diversity you have around whatever table it is that's asking those questions, the more likely it is that you'll get a debate about different perspectives and at least start having those conversations. And I think, you know, that's the really interesting aspect of it. And you know, to go back to my comment, I mean, when I was, you know, joined the board as the only woman, yes, that was a perspective, but also the fact that I still had young kids and was juggling work and kids meant that I brought a different perspective on how work-life balance was working in the organisation. The fact that my kids were at schools and talking about issues that reflected, you know, related to that company, where the company was saying, we don't think these are issues, and I'm saying, well, my kids are talking about it at school. That's the thing. You know, that's you know, it's diversity across every aspect. And as Stan says, it's got to be diversity that's actually spoken and then listened to.
I think also, you know, there's a paradox of diversity is that there's an assumption that you need more diverse voices to avoid the stereotyping and the assumptions that people make about them. But by putting people on the boards who become representative of those groups, you're applying the same stereotypes and assumptions. So diversity within diversity and perspectives within perspectives. I may be an Indigenous person who doesn't share views in common with other Indigenous people. The biggest challenge of my life is to be seen not just as an Indigenous person, yet to bring an Indigenous perspective to something, you know, an Indigenous person will be chosen. They can't possibly represent all of the various perspectives that exist within a broad Indigenous population. So it's a bit of it's a paradox, isn't it? As you were saying, you know, you brought different things to it than perhaps another woman may have brought on the phone.
I think though, oh, thanks, Ross. I think though there is an evidence base on this, which says that we are on the money in saying that diversity is on balance in terms of a range of different perspectives, better than homogeneity. I think we can safely assert that. And we should. And secondly, I think that the gender issues are, again, absolutely grounded in evidence base. Whether we're talking about culture of impunity, the ability to avoid being held accountable for very bad behaviour, there is a substantial body of evidence about, you know, who's in power and control, and to what extent those matters get dealt with. I think also in the context of sort of shared benefit and sort of some of the prevention arrangements around corruption, there is very good evidence about, in terms of the high value of investing in women and girls, including women and girl-led community and economic development initiatives in the global context. And I alluded to that actually recently in how we're framing up our response to the drought, and that we should absolutely ensure that we are bringing gender equality to where the dollars go in communities, because it is well established that when you invest in women-led initiatives, there is a particular additional value to the dollar that gets shared through the community.
No, Jeff, you have a question.
Am I in the air?
Could you just check that microphone, Dylan, please?
Should be working. Okay. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Oh, good. I want to make one brief statement and then ask a question directed to it, and that is that we have not brought out that we are living in an environment for the last 30 or 40 years where one of Marx's insights, that when finance capital gets out of kilter with industrial and commercial capital, you're going to get instability and often crisis. So when we're postulating reforms, that's one of the backgrounds we've got to think of. And my specific comment is, since banks and non-banking financial intermediaries are absolutely vital to how the society and economy works, because they're the sources of external finance, and without finance you don't get investment, and without investment you don't get reasonable levels of employment and levels of saving. Do you think one of the outcomes of the Royal Commission would be, and this draws on Productivity Council comment, that when you get rates of return, should not banks and financial intermediaries, because of their privileged situation in society, once they get rates of return above the average rate of return for the economy as a whole, be subject to really heavy excess profits tax?
Sorry, you go, Ross. No, you go.
Well, we do have a bank tax, which is very rough and ready, but it moves a long way in that direction. I think it's quite reasonable to expect that out of the Royal Commission will come the potential for a smaller financial sector. Certainly what we're getting is a reversal of the previous approach, which was to say, we're a big bank and we are going, and if any sort of money trading activity, we're going to have a slice of. And the banks are actually pulling back from that, partly because it's their investment advice arm that's got them into a lot of trouble, and other extras to pure banking. When you say, you say, well, you know, the bank's got this implicit guarantee, there is that tax that is meant to claw some of that back. But it's also true that we could get all the economic benefits of a big trading bank, a big financial system, with a financial system that was maybe a tenth of what it is now, because a whole host of things are going on that don't actually add to the efficiency of the allocation of resources.
But they do add to profits, right?
Yes, and you can, and the thing is that you can say that banking is risky, and you can say that banking profits are cyclical, and in the downturn they have all these bad debts. You can say that, but we haven't had any downturn for 27 years, and they've had very high profits, because one of these days there'll be a downturn. So I think you can certainly demonstrate that bank profits are higher than they need to be.
I think it's, I mean, the conversations around a rent tax, I mean, I think are interesting. They were explored in the Henry Tax Review and really, you know, have struggled to gain traction. Anyone who's interested, there's coming onto the CEDA stage in December, bit of promotion there, is a woman by the name of Mariana Mazzucato who's promoting her book, The Value of Everything, which goes directly to these questions about what is it that we value and where is real value generated. So I think they're interesting conversations that I suspect we'll be having more of.
Adam and then Scott, and then we'll come to the next question. No, sorry, I thought you were indicating you wanted to say something. Scott.
Just be really quick then. I suppose I just want to throw back onto the table to not forget the dimensions of politics and power in this stuff. And I think the only thing that people might recall from the Henry Tax Review, which was like about 5 inches thick, it was a huge document. The only thing anybody remembers was that they plucked the mining super profits tax out, threw that on the table, and then the industry lobby most directly impacted by that went after the Prime Ministership of Kevin Rudd and set off this cascade of instability that arguably we haven't managed to shake off yet. I don't think anybody's expecting the current Prime Minister to be around for more than a matter of months. And so we can come up with these wonderful ideas for this idea of a cap on rates of return. Either it's going to be taken away from you, or you invest it back inside the company, or the money goes elsewhere, is a wonderful idea. That's going to be political trench warfare. That might take 10 years. It's not good enough to come up with the idea, and I guess just want to throw that back on us. We need to get our campaigning boots on. These things, it's not enough to have the great idea. We've got to go out, and it's going to be kind of bruising getting some of this stuff done, because we will be taking on the most powerful economic interests in the country. And just look back at how that stuff has been done through history. It's bruising and it's costly for the people who take it on, but there's strength in numbers.
But that leads to an interesting point, and I will come to the next question, which is about economic performance and GDP as a measure of our country's well-being. And Ross, I think you've written about this. Scott, do you want to say some more about that?
I was going to say we should just abolish it, but I don't think that's true. I think it's become incredibly dangerous having that as the only dial on the dashboard.
And when the political dialogue becomes who's the best economic manager rather than the broader question.
We've had 20 years of just that, and by economic management I don't necessarily talking about full employment or abolishing homelessness or abolishing the gender pay gap. It's purely who's best at maximising that aggregate economic growth of money washing through the economy, no matter how many people are getting hurt, no matter how many forests are getting flattened, or whether we're throwing the temperature balance of the global climate out of whack. It's become dangerous to the point where some people are calling it's suicidal. Simply following that, a 3% annually compounding growth means your economy is doubled about every 24 or 25 years. We've been on that track for 200 or 300 years, and we are seriously now expecting another doubling out to about 2050, and then another doubling. And the biosphere is running out of...
Don't get me started.
All right, well...
you can
might
start,
be a doubling in GDP,
but
a doubling in GDP is not a doubling in resource use, which is what environmentalists care about.
It is if you're
because
running
we've got
a heavily
this thing called
resource-based
productivity.
economy.
Yeah, just hang on a minute. Give Ross a go.
Sure.
Go on, Ross.
Well, what is true is that we don't orientate the economy to economise in the use of natural resources. That's true. One of the measures that we had that would have moved us in that direction was a price on carbon. You could put a price on a lot of other natural things. We don't do that. We've actually got a taxing regime that encourages people to economise in the use of the most expensive resource, which is labour. Now, we could change that, but it's just not sensible for people to say GDP equals the kind of growth that an environmentalist cares about, because it doesn't.
Okay, Let's go back to the audience.
Thanks. I wanted to follow up on Jeff Harcourt's question with possibly an even more outrageous proposition. My perception is that a lot of the hollowing out of democracy that we've all been talking about today has a big part of it is the very low wage growth increasing inequality. You know, the typical American male has a lower real wage today than his grandfather had 45 years ago. That's a fact. Scott, I don't think they're happy about it. That's why they vote. You know, you've got this gulf now between, people looking for popular solutions and the elite. But when we turn to the elite, this gets back to Jeff's question, a big part of the pay of corporate executives is tied to share values. That's their measure of what they've contributed. But we are currently spending more on share buybacks and returns of funds to shareholders than we're spending on creating new real assets. And the counterpart of that would be the reason why companies are handing back money to shareholders is because there's not enough new real assets worth buying. The demand's too low because the wages are too low, therefore the demand's too low. So wouldn't it be better once you've got over what we'll call a normal rate of return, that if you want to engage in a share buyback, instead of that, you have to return funds to the community in some way. Because after all, it's the community that created the profits as much as any corporate executive.
Any reflections on that?
I genuinely think that business has to do a better job of showing the community that the community matters to them. So I think for a long time, there's been an effort and a narrative around business trying to say to the community, if only you realised how important we were to you, you would support us more and you would trust us more and all the rest of it. So the conversation...
And believe in trickle down.
Yeah, and so, so I do think that, part of my comments were about saying, how do you engage with the community and deliver genuine value back to the community through your engagement with them? My immediate concern when you talk about, well, okay, when you get to this level, then you distribute money back to the community, is that it's just going to be a waste. Because you'll just sit there and say, tick, fine, well, X% now goes to the community. And what you see that really works, and I think really works for business actually, is when they engage with the community. And when they do that in a way that throughout the organisation, people are actually working with the community to deliver solutions or to help a community achieve its aspirations. And I'm a really big believer of that. And what I've seen is when organisations actually do that, the interesting thing that they don't fully understand when they start is actually it really helps them because they start doing different things and they start behaving differently internally, and it actually drives innovation internally. So when we talk, I'm sure you've talked about shared value and all the rest of it, that's actually shared value.
Michael and I were just having this discussion before we went out for afternoon tea, actually, and this idea of the connection, the link between inequality and the economy more broadly, and the blowback against democracy and the rising populism. I think it's true to an extent. It's certainly part of the mix. But Eric Kaufman has just written a book called White Shift, which really he looks particularly at the UK and Brexit, and really takes on the idea about how much of that was economic and how much of that was cultural. And a lot of the vote for Brexit was not necessarily in the areas that were most economically stressed, but a lot of it was a cultural sense about the demographic and ethnic shift in the country that made people feel uneasy. I think it comes back to the point about people feeling as if the democracy speaks to and for them. I made the point to Michael before, just an observation I've made about Indigenous society, particularly a younger generation of Indigenous people, who, in many respects, we have a burgeoning middle class with the first generation of very wealthy Indigenous people, Indigenous millionaires. We've got more university graduates than ever before. But amongst a lot of the children of the Aboriginal middle class, for instance, you will see a hardening of sort of animosity and antagonism towards the idea of Australia because of the inability to see themselves politically represented in that. Maybe an economic place, but not necessarily a political voice. And I think the economic wherewithal and the educational access gives them the capacity to vocalise that and to have a voice that is then antagonistic. So I think the economics is part of the mix, but I think there is a real cultural aspect as well that we have to grapple with. It probably explains some of the disaffection and disenchantment with the faith in the processes of democracy.
Right, I've got a question here, a question there, a question here and a question there. Thank you.
Sue Spence from Griffith University. My question might deviate slightly from the current discussion. We've heard a lot today about issues around trust in government, in politics, in industry, and in delivery of social services. But one of the sets of institutions that were mentioned in the introduction related to religious organisations and institutions. And I wondered if any of the panel have any suggestions about how today's discussions may be of relevance to the churches or other religious institutions, and how, I mean, they've taken a big hit recently, and how they could be going about this issue about re-establishing integrity and our trust in those organisations.
And of course they get very favourable tax treatment too. Who on the panel would like to respond to that? Cassandra?
Look, I think it's definitely in the spotlight for all the right reasons. And I think, again, affirming for me the ability to turn up every day and be optimistic is, for example, that when finally some parts of the community discovered that actually it's been entirely lawful for a very long time for faith-based organisations to discriminate both, children in schools, the workforce, the teachers, in all kinds of faith-based community organisations, that there was this shocked and new outrage about it, that to the extent that the faith-based organisations tried to defend it, it was just not tolerated. And, for example, when ACOS confirmed our very clear position that we're a human rights-based organisation, we stand firmly against the ability for discrimination in any context, including the workforces in faith-based social services, nobody's rung me to complain about that. I think the level of tolerance around this kind of exceptionalism for religious organisations to be able to put themselves separate to what would be now increasingly considered very normalised approaches to anti-discrimination is, I think, encouraging. But obviously, we're still I think we're about to flare that beast again. We'll see as we get through this next debate about the protection of the right to religious freedom. And we've got a real risk that we'll go into more culture wars around that. And I certainly hope that the majority in the community speaks up for a very sensible approach. There are many people within faith-based organisations that don't want these kinds of privileges either.
Having said that, I'd be tempted by a proposition that said you can keep your exemptions from human rights, but you've got to give back your tax breaks. So which matters to you more?
Jane, can I, at the risk of stealing the thunder of the floor, can I just go back? Stan said something that I just wanted to reflect on. It sort of triggered something to me that goes to this whole question of trust. I don't know how many years ago it is now, Stan, I should remember, but I can't. The federal government committed to a process for recognising First Australians in the Constitution. We had an expert panel review, then we had another review, then we had another committee and another consultation process and so on and so forth. And this just went on and on, and it's got on and on and on and on. And then the government said to the community, okay, well, you guys get your act together, right? You guys go and get your act together and you reach agreement. And they did, right? And they went to Uluru and they worked hard and they consulted and they formed a view and they compromised. And they were pragmatic and they worked to deliver a solution for government. And government stood up and interpreted that in the narrowest way and then threw it straight back. And if you want to talk about trust, over-promising and relying on the good faith of communities year in and year out, and then doing something like that, that's what destroys trust. And when you talk about all the policy where people pretend that it's not hard, no one's going to lose, and you have those simplistic conversations, what you end up getting is a community that doesn't listen to you anymore.
And the minister at the time, when faced with this, said the community, the broader community, won't accept it. And the interviewer said to him, on what do you base that, Minister? And he said, I don't need evidence, I just know.
Well, what's even worse is that the evidence was contrary to that.
Yeah. Well, the
evidence was
exactly the opposite.
All of the polling showed exactly the opposite. So it's a bold-faced lie.
It just goes back to that point I made earlier, and I just come back to it time and time again, is that when you hollow out the centre, so-called, from politics, when it becomes a politically neutral zone, a political solution like that is seen as something that is archaic and unacceptable. So reconciliation trumps politics when it comes to Indigenous issues. Sorry, gestures of apology, welcomes to country, yes, reconciliation action plans in business and universities for increased participation. But the moment you insert the political, that's seen as something that is utterly out of order. And we've gone backwards from the 80s, self-determination and ASSA for all of its faults, and Mabo, which was not just a recognition of native title, but also part of the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which specifies some form of self-determination. We've retreated from that and supplanted instead a reconciliation-based agenda that has no room for politics. And when you neutralise politics from the centre of your civil life and civic life, you banish it to the fringes where it festers. And that's what we're seeing.
Thank you. Now I'm going to the question here.
I'd like to get back to the title of this particular session, which is Solutions, looking forward it says they're regenerating. I don't think this country's ever had integrity and trust in great measure, so I would remove the re and talk about generating. And I take Stan to be my model here, whether it's the white immigration policy and the Mabo, and all the way back to stolen children. It goes on and on. So that's my first plea or premise. And my second one is that I think intuitively that, Scott, you and your colleagues up the hill are the most important models for the nation. After all, we elect you guys and we expect a certain type of response in the way of behaviour, civility. So question time, for example, is absolutely a terrible model. But anyway, that's now to get my point. A solution, I've got one. Everybody believe that I have one? Well, anyway, this is what I'd like to put forward. I am a fellow of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, and I'm also part of the University of Melbourne. In both those organisations, we have very strong, robust codes of ethics. The word ethics has barely been mentioned today. We've had allusions to principles, honesty, and so on. So, of course, ethics is there in the background. I'd like to put in a plea for bringing it to the foreground. So if you take, Scott, you and your colleagues, and modelling ethical behaviour, ethical principles in action, unfortunately, there have only been 3 matters of that kind. So I won't go into the details, but it's in the gift of the Prime Minister only. And Howard brought up one thing, Rudd brought up another thing, and recently, I think in the most ungracious way, Turnbull said no bonking in the office. I think that's pretty poor show on the part of our representatives. So what I want to ask, and I suppose, Scott, if you were back in the Parliament or if you could influence your colleagues there in your party and elsewhere, whether it's time for the profession of politicians, after all, you profess certain expertise. You know how to conduct negotiations. You know how to produce legislation. I mean, there are lots of things you're supposed to know things about. So I'm calling it a profession, and professions profess expertise, and that's about competence and so on. But professions also have usually a link to ethics. And so let me perhaps get to the point through my own experience very briefly. In 1990, psychiatry had numerous scandals. Maybe some of you remember deep sleep therapy, which killed 24 people. And as a result of that, the college thought, oh my goodness, we better get on with producing something to ward that sort of behaviour off. So in 1990, a few of the ethics committee got together. I was part of that. 92, we had our first code. Last night, I mentioned our fifth code has just been produced. We are very proud of our code of ethics. And it's not rules, which the Parliament has plenty, and which parliamentarians always say, no, it's within the rules. I can take my grandchild on a holiday and so on. It's informed by principles which draw back on Aristotle and all the others. So we believe in our college that this code is probably the most central thing in our lives, our professional lives. During the 30 years that we've been doing this sort of thing in the college, many other organisations, I have a habit of looking them up, hundreds of organisations, of professional organisations, have devised codes of ethics. Prior to the 80s, 70s, no organisation of any size or merit had a code of ethics. So there are very few left. And I would like to ask Scott and anybody else who's an aspiring politician, why it is that our politicians, our parliament, has not created a code of ethics with teeth and which everybody should know. So every politician would go to bed at night with the code underneath.
I think you've made the point.
Yeah, no, all right,
I think you've made the
with
point.
the code underneath their pillow.
Other questions. I think it's a bit unfair to ask Scott to be responsible for the whole, what is it, 500 people or so?
Oh, no, come on.
I think Scott's able to do that.
I'll have a really brief go. I feel like, in a way, the discussion we've been dancing around all day, it's not so much the code of ethics, it's the teeth. I'm more interested in the teeth. Like some of the stuff that we've been discussing today around integrity commissions, anti-corruption bodies, and enforceable ways for politicians to go to jail if you screw up hard enough. That will have to have the ethics baked into it, but I'm more interested in the kind of hard institutional checks and balances that are lacking on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're one of the few jurisdictions, at least in the Western world, that has no enforceable human rights framework for everybody outside of Parliament. I think that's a discussion. A few speakers, I think, glanced at it a little bit today, but we haven't gone into it in detail, is that most of our human rights are implied. We assume they're there because we watch a lot of American television, or because the High Court took a bit of a glance at political communication years and years ago. So I suppose I'm more interested in the short term in bringing about some of those hard mechanisms for enforcing the ethics than putting something under a pillow that can kind of be freely ignored at convenience. The other things I think we suffer from relative to other jurisdictions are really rigid party discipline. I love the fact that in theory, like I didn't train as a politician or as a lawyer or as, I didn't come from senior levels of industry. I was an artist. And the system still allowed space for somebody like me with all of the immense privilege of being a middle-class white male in this country. But there's still place in our system for very non-professional, non-political people to be at the table, and that's kind of where you could see the people who framed up the Constitution are trying to create a deliberative assembly of folk elected by a popular franchise to not be professional politicians and also not stick around too long. Let's talk about term limits for politicians. So I feel like there's a bunch of really practical stuff that would cohere around a code of ethics, and in a way we've travelled a fair distance today, I suppose, in framing up what some of those are. It's just that you then need to get that particular cohort of people to vote for this stuff. That's why we don't have a national ICAC, because the people who would be subjected to it keep finding reasons not to do it. And that's a really deeply political question.
Thank you. Adam.
I want to take the discussion to distinguish a code of ethics from a code of conduct, and to ask a larger question. In a lot of ways, a code of conduct is a set of rules, it's what you do. A code of ethics is what you are. And when I don't want to speak for politicians, but just to speak generally, in terms of societies that do well, they do well because of what they are. Societies that have high integrity, societies that have universalism and not particularism, that is what they are. You can make rules till the cows come home. When in the work I do on corruption, people say we need more rules. We don't need more rules. There's a rule for everything, but there's always somebody on the make. And that person will always get around the rules. Now, you talk about psychiatrists. I listened to Norman Swan on the health report the other day, who was lamenting the bullying and the harassment that surgeons have, and and so many young medical people are feeling harassed, the workplaces are not safe for them, and the point he was making was saying this leads to a lack of safety for patients. But the point is, as Scott quite rightly said, it's the teeth behind it, and the teeth don't come in terms of what you do, but what we are. And the solution to that is to build integrity with school children, to understand concepts of fairness, not cheating in sport, and to build that into everyday life rather than laying out a set of rules.
Now, before we go to the next question, and I want to bring Val in, because she's sitting here having a very quiet, nice time. And I think the point that you raised, Adam, harks back to something you said, Val, earlier in your presentation, which was about the need for trust and how the ability to trust is inculcated initially in the family. And I'd like your comments on whether these other values of fairness, values of ethical behaviour are also really in that, before these kids even get to school, it's all in the early family experience. And if it is, and we have families that fail on that front, can we do something about it, or are we stuck?
Well, I think we are sorely in need of good family policy. I think the policies that...
I think we need the microphone a bit closer.
Okay. I think the policies that are affecting families are pretty fragmented, really. So from a policy perspective, families should be there right in the middle of things, and we should be organising a whole lot of support around families. And I guess the indicator that we're not doing that is our child protection system, which really is geared to removing children from families, particularly Indigenous children. I mean, we've gone backwards in that particular area. But can I stray from my assigned topic?
Go where you like.
I have been sitting here having a nice time and being very quiet. And, you know, I have one thing in common with Pauline Hanson. We have an identity, a shared identity. I come from Ipswich. And some of you may not know this, but the Ipswich City Council recently was dissolved because of corruption problems. Ipswich has also had some dramas recently in that, you know, dumping is a big thing, particularly by motorcycle gangs and illegal syndicates of various kinds. And so the empty mines in Ipswich are being filled up with the waste from the south. And so I found myself thinking about my Ipswich family, and I thought, what would they make of this discussion that we were having this afternoon? Of course, they'd feel totally left out of it. They wouldn't understand it. They wouldn't see it having any connection with them. And that's where the lack of trust, I think, starts. Now, that's not a criticism of what we're doing here. I think it needs to be seen within the context of a phenomenon worldwide that's come with globalisation and deregulation. Both those things have led to the explosion of something that we call regulatory capitalism. We're not under-regulated, we're regulated in so many ways, not just by formal regulators, professional associations, business councils, peak bodies. In fact, everyone up here is part of a mechanism that is regulating. Now, we have to understand each other, and that's what we're doing today. So my proposition to you is that the lack of trust that the community has in our systems and our institutions might be because we're having so much trouble trying to understand each other that we're spending all our time communicating and talking to each other and completely ignoring the community out there. And if we could somehow find the energy and the resources, or perhaps just think about community a bit more and start talking to them about policies in terms of benefits, in terms of justice, and also talking about moral obligation. You know, what is their moral obligation to actually cooperate and trust the whatever it is that we're asking of them as authorities of various kinds. Solutions, I think there are solutions that we haven't talked about today. For my family, dealing with the dumping problem in Ipswich, I'd be really tempted to try a restorative justice conference up there if they actually found those guilty of doing the dumping. I think it would be very interesting to have a restorative justice conference between the citizens of Ipswich and their so-called council that was there to represent them. These are mechanisms that we have for addressing harm. They don't go through a legal route in the sense that we find out who's done the wrong thing, which goes on for years, and then there's a penalty given out for that. That penalty rarely actually helps the people affected. But we know harm is being done, and so what we need are new mechanisms to try to address that harm. And if we did that, and if we showed we were trying to do that, then I suspect that we'd be making big inroads into rebuilding the trust of the community in us.
Thank you. Andrew, I've been waiting very patiently.
Thank you, Jane. I wanted to go back to the title of the day about trust in Australian institutions and the issue of institutions. I have a theory that a lot of the problem of recent years, particularly in Australia, has been the problem of politics, notwithstanding very good people trying to do very good jobs. But the political system has let us down in a number of areas. And some of the politicians I've dealt with over the last couple of decades seem to think that only the democratic process is important, and fail to see that there are all sorts of other institutions that are important to responsible government. So you have the separation of powers, and how do we make sure that we understand the separation of powers and the different values of the different arms of government? How do we understand the difference between politics and administration? The public service has a code of conduct as well as the APS values, and as Adam would know, the APS values basically represent what the institution is, about the nature of the institution. But we also get that in other areas, so that in the values of the business sector and the values of the community sector are different. They're important, but they are different. And it's important to recognise those differences if you're going to work out how the things work together. Even within business, it's important to understand that the values can differ between different governance arrangements. One could ask the question, did some of AMP's problems come when they moved from being a mutual to being a for-profit? Did that change the incentive frameworks that are around? So I'm wondering whether a real important issue is to understand the difference of different institutions, the different values they bring to bear, and have an understanding that collectively is very important to know those differences and to have an understanding and appreciation of them and get the trust in that range of institutions we have.
I'm not sure that that's a question, but does anybody want to respond to the comment?
Oh, sorry, Cassandra.
Well, maybe for the sake of some continuity, Andrew, I think understanding the differences is a very healthy thing. That in this context, this is who I am as an actor, and I'm not trying to be all things to all people. And I think Melinda talked about, as one of the elements in your approach to rebuilding confidence in business, was the preparedness for business to understand its role in the community setting and the place-based approaches. And Valerie, I think some of what you're talking about in giving Ipswich as a for example, there is some common ground that I consistently hear actually across from business where, and I have small business friends, very close friends of mine, who have to make a buck. They have to make the bottom line work for them in operating their small businesses. And you have the community sector or not-for-profit entities whose primary purpose is to ensure that the people who are vulnerable in the community are okay. But what you can do is by bringing the relationships closer together at a community and a regional level, in our view, and we've got many examples of it, where you get closer to understanding each other, you can find the ways in which you can each meet your core imperatives, and it feels great to do it. You know, the number of businesses that would like to be involved in tackling the long-term unemployment challenge in Australia is very real and genuine, I think. But we won't do that unless we are working in the local labour market in a regional environment with the best and the smarts of those different perspectives that get brought into that kind of work, rather than the latest fad, frankly, that pops out of Canberra. Random drug testing might be one of them, you know, coming to a place near you. So I think that's where we've got some great potential in rebuilding trust in the sort of, you know, creating a better future and a sense of confidence in those institutional participants in that work.
Now, I'm now got to watch the time, haven't I, Adam? So I have another question up here. This, Bob, I think it is, has been waiting for some time.
I'd like to bring it back to the issue of trust in our political government institutions, particularly federal and state. It seems to me that one of the big deficiencies that is generating lack of trust is the inability to have sustained leadership, to a strong sustained leadership to address big societal issues and to do that in a systemic way. They're fairly obvious to us. The big issues facing our society relate to, inter alia, our taxation system, housing, access to affordable and appropriate housing, adequate funding for access to health and education, national security, environmental issues, the affordability of energy, and so on. The last time we had any concerted attempts at the federal level to address major systemic change and reform was the Hawke government. And I think we need to also recognise that that was aided and abetted by John Howard as leader of the coalition opposition, getting on board and voting with it. We haven't had that sort of bipartisanship since. So what is it, and how can we overcome the barriers to having sustained leadership to address solutions to these big societal issues? When we have had them, such as the Henry Tax Review, it was basically discarded. And what the response of governments tends to be to issues is knee-jerk action on one dimension, which will have a lot of unintended consequences. It's not thought through, and that is just engendering, I think, in the mind of the public, frustration, turn-off, and lack of trust.
I'm going to take that as a yes, you can. But I'm going to ask you to keep it
Yeah,
fairly
no,
brief.
no.
Because
I just wanted to make an observation. You mentioned the Hawke-Keating government, and just from the perspective of sort of working in the media and seeing the way these things are reported and the constant reporting of crisis, everything is a crisis, and the constant opinion polling and the 24-hour news cycle where you don't get an hour to even think, you know, you'll get 5 minutes. Could you imagine the Hawke-Keating reforms with double-digit inflation, 17% interest rates? Could you imagine trying to get re-elected in this climate? No way. Would not have happened. And given the climate, you mentioned John Howard and the sort of bipartisan support that he offered to those reforms, in the combative nature of today's politics, where it is driven by the votes on the fringe and the constant opinion polling, would you have relied on that same instinct for good governance, or would you have seen the instinct for politics and power trump that? It's an interesting thing to just consider, given the different climate then to what exists now.
Jane, sorry, I want to focus on solutions too, and I'll give you an example. When I worked at the Productivity Commission, I worked with Peter Harris on the Data Access and Review Inquiry. One of the things that Peter was very focused on was how you implement policy. So not just coming up with the grand ideas, but how you implemented it and how you demonstrated that it worked for people. Right? So he, I have to say, cottoned on very early to the fact that something like a consumer data right, which connected what you were talking about directly to people in a very tangible way, was very important. And I think we need more of that. I think we need more of every policy connecting to people, so that part of the conversation is, this is how you in Ipswich can benefit from this or might benefit from it, and we don't do enough of that.
Okay, I'm sorry the time is getting away from us because we're all just getting warmed up, but let me give other panel members the opportunity for a final few words if they'd like it. Ross, shall I start with you? Nothing more? Cassandra, anything more from you?
Plenty more, but let's wrap it up, I know, and let's make sure this is a continuing conversation, I think, because it's not going away.
Yes, I'd add one thing which I touched on this morning, and Ross Hommel, I think, suggested to me that I could bring out more strongly. I haven't heard much about the rule of law today, and I know how old-fashioned that sounds, but it seems to me to be at the centre of trust and integrity in many institutions. I'd welcome a more substantive and fuller idea of the rule of law and promotion of access to justice, but it seems to me to be a reasonable starting point that we haven't possibly developed much today.
Adam, anything further from you?
One very quick response to Bob. When you said sustained leadership, you talked about politicians. There's also the public service to consider, and what we've seen is a hollowing out of a lot of capacity in the public service. There is no opportunity to sit and think and plan scenarios in the way that there might have been, and so there are two dimensions. There's the politics and the politicians and the public servants.
Stan, any last words? Scott?
Yeah, the thing that occurred, and just maybe to end on a note of cautious optimism, is that democracies are self-correcting. It's not all doom and gloom. It's a reason why some of them have stuck around in some instances for hundreds of years. I feel as though the Wentworth by-election, a very recent data point, like we've got a government at the moment that is trying to perfect this really cheap, throwaway, disposable, self-interested short-term politics, and they're tanking. Like, they're doing really badly. Surely that's a sign of hope. In the United States, they've just recorded the highest voter turnout in a midterm election in more than 100 years. And obviously the results are heavily contested, but we have to hope and believe that democracy is self-correcting. And for me, that gives me motivation to get up and keep having a crack.
Thank you. Val, any last word? All right, then would you join me, please, in thanking our panel? And indeed the audience for participating, but I think we've had a really wide-ranging debate here this afternoon, and thank you all for your contributions. Okay, the last thing on the programme says Symposium closing address by Academy President-elect. And you can stay there if you want, or you can go.
It says what?
It says Symposium closing address by Academy President-elect. And, well, I think you should all be very pleased that I don't have 25 slides and a 30-minute address prepared. But I do have a few comments and a few thank yous. So I think the panel has been a wonderful example of what we've had all day, which is a richness in perspectives and a really wide-ranging discussion about so many facets of trust, integrity, and institutions. And for that, we have to thank the two Adams, or the Adams squared, as I would say, for their skill and their hard work, and I'm sure their powers of persuasion in bringing these people together. So please join me in thanking them. I hope you can indulge me, though, for just a couple of minutes, because I would like to pick up some reflections, some really random reflections on things that I think haven't come out during the day, rich as it's been. I think one of the first things that I think has really been underrepresented in the discussions we've had here today is not what I would call the women's issue, but the explicitness of women's anger at the moment. And I don't think it's that women are newly angry, but we're now so explicit about it, about the issue of trust and harm and the way it's been done. And I think an underlying value for this is about respect, and it's about respect for all individuals, and that's what women have suffered a lack of. Now, we're not the only group in society to suffer that, but we have had such a sea change in social mores on that front. It surely has to give us optimism for other changes as well. But I think we haven't heard enough about that. We haven't talked much about technology and the challenges that are arising from technology. And if you talk to your more technological, your engineering, your hard science colleagues, you'll hear that they have perceptions that I think are more advanced than much of the political debate. The political debate is about technological change and how it's going to change all sorts of things and open up all sorts of new possibilities. But the challenges that are coming from technological change are all social science challenges. They're about what makes society function, what makes a good society, and it's about how should we live. And that's something for us to all take on and to look at. I think at the same time that we're talking about both technology changing trust, it's building trust that people would have never once had. You know, you go back and you read 1984 and you read about this dystopia where organisations, let's not just say governments, were collecting so much detail on so many individuals, and yet so many people freely enter into that. So at the same time as we've got mistrust and distrust in so many ways, we've got a rise of trust in other ways. And the rise of the sharing economy is an amazing example of that. People will use complete strangers to pick them up in completely strange cars and take them to places. People will lend their homes to people they've never met and might never meet, with everything in it. So we've got this, it's almost an inconsistency, perhaps it's even a contradiction. And yet then, of course, business moves in, and what we see with Airbnb is how many people are turning that into business opportunities. So the initial idea of sharing and trusting is being changed. One more observation, and that is around choice. We've talked about trust. We haven't talked much about choice and the choices individuals make. We've talked about technology, particularly information technology, delivering more information on which people can make choices. But what are the implications of that in a society with information overload? I mean, how many people really scrutinise their energy bills and decide to change their energy provider? We know they don't do it very much in health insurance. And in so many other ways, how much time have people got, which takes us back to how shall we live, to be constantly engaged in information seeking and making those choices? So I felt we didn't have much on that. And maybe one of the things we've done, and in the way we teach, in the way we provide information, is to reduce people's concentration spans. And what are the consequences of that? That surely is something for parts of this academy to deal with. So they're the random reflections I want to leave you with. I think for the academy and for me as President-elect, the big challenge is how do we take the analysis, how do we take the insights, and how do we move from analysis to action to really make a difference? So thank you for listening to that. No symposium like this works without the support and the efforts and the unwavering attention of the Secretariat. I think they're out there, most of them, setting up drinks at the moment, but I hope you'll join me in conveying to them our thanks for their work, their hard work and their support. And this has been a particularly difficult few days. We're all mourning the departure of John Beaton, but I think I can say to each one of the Secretariat members, you've done him proud. This has gone off without a hitch. Everything has gone smoothly. He would be so proud and so pleased. And I want to add my own, I want to take this opportunity to add my own just note of appreciation for John. I know he did a lot for this academy, but for me, as a new fellow, he was friendly, he was welcoming, he was supportive, and then he started to give me jobs. And that probably sums up his belief, his commitment, his trust, and his devotion to this academy, and we all owe him a great debt. My final task is to invite you to the President's Drinks. Now, President's Drinks is a bit of a misnomer, particularly if you're the current President who's about to give the Cunningham lecture, so he's not allowed to drink at all, but the rest of you are. Please come continue the conversations that we've started this afternoon and be back here in half an hour for the Cunningham lecture. Thank you.